Boss of bosses murdered. On July 12, 1979, the 69-year-old boss of a New York crime family sat down for lunch on the back patio of an Italian-American restaurant in Brooklyn, New York. The man was someone who had clawed his way to the top through decades of violence and intimidation. He controlled heroin trafficking routes worth millions and answered to no one. That afternoon, he felt untouchable. The patio was quiet and private, shaded by a small garden. The boss sat at a table with his cigar clamped between his teeth, a habit that had become his trademark. 4 others sat with him. A crime family captain, the restaurant owner and his cousin, and his 2 Sicilian bodyguards. The meal was simple: fish, salad, wine. It was the kind of peaceful moment that men in his world rarely enjoyed, but the boss had earned it, or so he believed. At 2:45 in the afternoon, 3 men wearing ski masks entered the restaurant. They moved fast. No warning, no hesitation. Shotguns and pistols came up. The first blast hit the table. The boss's companions scrambled, but there was nowhere to go. The gunman unleashed a barrage of fire. Shotgun pellets tore into the boss's chest and face. Pistol rounds followed, rapid and precise. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Within seconds, it was over. The boss was blown backward onto the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The captain and restaurant owner lay dead beside him. His bodyguards remained untouched. They had betrayed him. When police arrived, they found a scene that would become legendary in mob history. The boss was dead, his upper body riddled with wounds, but his cigar remained clenched tightly between his teeth, still intact despite the violence that had torn through him. Photographers captured the image. The cigar became a symbol, a final act of defiance frozen in death. The hit had been ordered by the Commission, the ruling body of New York's 5 families. The boss had grown too powerful, too reckless. His own organization had betrayed him. He died as he lived, arrogant and fearless, never seeing the end coming until it was too late. Plastic surgery gone wrong. On July 4th, 1997, the man known as the Lord of the Skies checked into a hospital in Mexico City under a false name. The drug lord was a billionaire. He controlled air routes that moved tons of cocaine across the Americas. His fortune was estimated at $25 billion. But all that money couldn't buy him freedom. Mexican and American authorities were closing in, and his face was too recognizable to hide. The solution, he believed, was radical. He would undergo extensive facial reconstruction surgery and liposuction to alter his appearance completely. 3 medical professionals were hired for the operation: an otorhinolaryngologist and 2 plastic surgeons. 2 of the drug lord's bodyguards were present in the operating room during the procedure. The surgery lasted 8 hours. During the operation, complications arose. The medication combination, hypnotic drugs mixed with anesthesia, caused respiratory arrest, leading to cardiac failure. Medical efforts to reverse the complications were unsuccessful. In the early hours of July 5th, the 41-year-old drug lord died. His death was confirmed by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration through fingerprint analysis, and later verified by Mexican authorities using DNA testing on July 11th. His body was displayed publicly at the Federal Judicial Police morgue in Mexico City. Photographs were taken and distributed to convince a skeptical world that the untouchable kingpin had fallen. Yet, conspiracy theories persist to this day, with some claiming the drug lord faked his death. 4 months later, the 3 doctors who had operated on the drug lord vanished. Their bodies were discovered in concrete-filled oil drums along the Mexico-Acapulco highway. All showed signs of torture. Mexican prosecutors had charged the doctors with intentionally killing the drug lord, though whether they died as cartel revenge or to silence witnesses remains disputed. Delirious Urinal Assassination. On October 23, 1935, the legendary bootlegger walked into a chop house in Newark, New Jersey for a business meeting with his associates. The 33-year-old mobster had built an empire during Prohibition, controlling beer distribution across the Bronx and Manhattan. He was ruthless, paranoid, and had made countless enemies. That night, despite having his accountant, chief lieutenant, and bodyguard with him, fate would catch up with him. Around 10:15 in the evening, the bootlegger excused himself from the table and walked to the men's room. 2 hitmen entered the restaurant. One made his way to the bathroom and opened the door. The bootlegger ducked the first shot. The second struck him just below his heart, the rust-coated bullet ricocheting through his abdomen. He dropped to the floor. The gunman then joined his partner and both opened fire on the bootlegger's associates in the back room. Despite being mortally wounded, the bootlegger's men returned fire, driving the assassins away. The bootlegger managed to stagger out of the bathroom and collapsed in the dining area. He was rushed to a Newark hospital, still conscious but fading. Doctors worked frantically to stop the internal bleeding, but the damage was severe. Worse, the rusted bullet had introduced infection deep into his wounds. Within hours, fever took hold. His temperature reached 106 degrees. Delirium set in. For 22 hours, the bootlegger lingered between life and death. On October 24th, between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, a police stenographer sat by his bedside, recording his delirious words, hoping for information about his criminal network. What came out instead was a surreal, nonsensical stream of consciousness. He rambled about French-Canadian bean soup, harmony, and a boy who hadn't had his brains blown out. His words twisted and looped, making no sense. The fever consumed him. His speech became more more fragmented, more desperate. He muttered about mothers, shooters, and police. At times he seemed aware, at others completely lost in hallucination. Finally, later that evening on October 24th, the bootlegger stopped breathing from peritonitis. His final recorded words remain one of the most bizarre deathbed statements in criminal history. About 2,000 words of feverish rambling preserved on paper, a glimpse into a mind unraveling as infection and blood loss shut down his body. Barbershop chair slaughter. On October 25th, 1957, the feared leader of an organized crime enforcement squad walked into the barbershop at a hotel in New York City around 10:15 in the morning. The 55-year-old mob boss was known as a ruthless executioner, a man who had personally ordered hundreds of killings. He trusted almost no one, but the barbershop felt safe. It was routine, familiar, a place where he could relax. With him was his godson, who took a seat in chair number 5. The mob boss settled into chair number 4 and leaned back. The barber draped towels over him and began the ritual. Hot towels were applied to the mob boss's face, steaming and heavy, preparing his skin for a close shave. His face was covered. He couldn't see. For a few minutes, he was completely vulnerable. At 10:20 in the morning, 2 men wearing scarves over their faces pushed through the door. They moved with purpose. One of the gunmen used his pistol to shove the barber aside. The shooters positioned themselves on either side of the chair. Their focus was entirely on the man beneath the towels. The first shots rang out. The mob boss pulled the towels from his face and started to get up, disoriented. Blood appeared on his body. More shots followed, 5 bullets finding their target. The mob boss saw the mirror in front of him, 2 figures with guns, reflections. In his confusion and panic, the mob boss lunged toward the mirror, reaching for the gunmen he thought were behind the glass. He crashed into the glass shelving, shattering it as he fell. His godson fled, yelling as he ran from the shop. The shooters turned and walked out calmly. The entire attack had lasted less than a minute. The mob boss lay sprawled on the floor, blood covering the towels still draped across his body. The feared executioner had died helpless, blinded by towels, lunging at his own killers in a mirror. Sausage cooking ambush. On June 19, 1975, the powerful boss of a Chicago crime organization was in the basement kitchen of his home in Oak Park, Illinois, cooking a late-night meal. The 67-year-old mob boss had connections that reached into the highest levels of American power. He had worked with the CIA on plots to eliminate foreign leaders. He had ties to President Kennedy. But that night, he was just a man making sausage and peppers. The mob boss was preparing the meal, likely intended for his visitor. Earlier that evening, he had hosted guests who departed around 11 p.m. His caretaker left the basement at approximately 11:20 p.m. after ensuring the mob boss needed nothing further. That sense of security was a fatal mistake. Someone he trusted had been let into the house. The visitor entered through a back entrance leading to the basement apartment. The mob boss continued cooking, his back turned to the person who had come to kill him. There was no alarm, no sudden realization of threat. The lack of any signs of struggle would later indicate he never anticipated the attack. The first shot hit him in the back of the head. The mob boss dropped instantly. His body collapsed onto the basement floor, but the shooter wasn't finished. 6 more shots followed, carefully placed. 1 under the chin, 5 more into his face. Several bullets struck his mouth, a deliberate message. The pattern was intentional. This was not just murder, it was a warning. The shots to the mouth were symbolic, a silencing of a man who knew too many secrets. Investigators would later speculate that the mob boss had been preparing to testify before Congress about CIA operations. Someone had decided he could never be allowed to speak. Approximately 30 minutes after leaving the basement, the caretaker returned to check on the mob boss. He found his body lying in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. The stove was still lit, the pan still on the burner. The caretaker placed an emergency call at 11:53 p.m. The mob boss had died in the middle of the most mundane activity, betrayed by someone close enough to walk into his home unquestioned. Eye blown out. On June 20th, 1947, the handsome gangster who had helped envision modern Las Vegas sat relaxed on a floral-patterned sofa in Beverly Hills, California, reading the Los Angeles Times. The 41-year-old mobster was staying at the home of his mistress while she was in Paris. That evening, his associate sat beside him on the couch, while the homeowner's brother, his girlfriend, and the cook occupied other parts of the house. He had no reason to expect danger. Outside, a gunman moved silently through the darkness of the property. He carried an M1 carbine, a military rifle known for accuracy and stopping power. The shooter positioned himself in an archway of the driveway, concealed by shrubbery, and rested his weapon on a trellis near a window that offered a clear view into the living room. Through the glass, he could see the mobster sitting perfectly still, absorbed in the newspaper he had picked up at a restaurant earlier that evening. The target was unaware, unguarded, and completely exposed. The gunman raised the rifle and took careful aim. At approximately 10:45 in the evening, he pulled the trigger. 9 rounds shattered through the window in rapid succession. The first bullet struck the mobster at the bridge of his nose with devastating precision, instantly knocking his left eye completely out of its socket and destroying the left side of his face. The eyeball traveled 15 feet across the room, landing on the tiled floor near the dining area. 3 more bullets found their mark. Another struck his right cheek and exited through his neck, and 2 punctured his torso. The remaining shots hit the wall behind him. The mobster died instantly, while his associate dove to the floor, unharmed except for a bullet hole through his jacket sleeve. The mobster's body remained on the couch. When police arrived, they found a scene of brutal efficiency. The mobster lay on the sofa, slumped backward with his head lolling to the side, his face destroyed. Blood soaking into the chintz-covered fabric. Crime scene investigators documented every detail, including the location of his severed eye across the room. Photographs of the body would later become some of the most infamous images in mob history. The man who had built a famous hotel and dreamed of transforming a desert town into an empire had died in borrowed luxury, killed by multiple perfect shots. His vision for Las Vegas would live on, but the mobster himself was gone, his face destroyed in an instant. Cornfield buried alive. On June 14, 1986, the volatile enforcer for a Chicago crime organization received a phone call that would end his life. The 48-year-old hitman was told he was being promoted, called to a meeting in Bensenville, Illinois to discuss his new position. He was instructed to bring his brother. Both men believed they were rising in the organization. The truth was far darker. When they arrived at the designated location, a basement in a quiet residential area, the enforcer and his brother were led inside. The room was empty except for several men waiting for them. There was no promotion, no ceremony. The moment they realized the trap, it was already too late. The attack began immediately. Fists and feet came from every direction. No weapons were used. This was hands-on violence, deliberate and sustained. Bones cracked under the force of repeated blows. Both brothers tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed. The beating continued for several minutes, methodical and brutal. Blood covered the floor. Their faces swelled beyond recognition. Consciousness slipped away and returned in waves of agony. When the assault finally stopped, both men were barely breathing. They were dragged from the basement and loaded into a vehicle. The drive took over an hour, crossing state lines into Indiana. A remote cornfield had been chosen in advance. A shallow grave had already been dug. The enforcer and his brother were dumped into the hole, their bodies broken and failing. Dirt was shoveled on top of them quickly. Medical examiners would later find evidence that suggested a possibility too grim to fully confirm. Soil particles were discovered in their airways. Their lungs showed signs consistent with attempts to breathe. The brothers may have still been alive when the earth was piled over them, suffocating in darkness as the weight pressed down. 5 days passed before a farmer noticed freshly turned soil in his field. He called authorities. When the bodies were unearthed, decomposition had already begun. The enforcer, the man who inspired a character in a famous film, had met an end as violent as the life he lived. Indestructible Irishman bombing. On October 6, 1977, the man known as the Irishman walked out of his dentist's office in Lyndhurst, Ohio, completely unaware that his luck had finally run out. The 43-year-old racketeer had survived so many assassination attempts that he seemed untouchable. Bombs had been planted under his car, in his apartment, at his office. Shooters had ambushed him on the street every time he walked away. He taunted the Italian mafia openly, daring them to try again. His confidence had become legendary. That afternoon was routine. A dental appointment to fix a loose filling, nothing more. The racketeer had taken precautions, borrowing his associate's brown car to confuse his enemies, as they periodically switched cars. Yet he remained a walking target, aware of the danger but unable to avoid every threat. He stepped into the parking lot, keys in hand, arriving 20 minutes late at 2:20 p.m. and parking in the middle of the lot. What the racketeer didn't know was that hitmen had been watching and waiting. The mafia had tapped his phone and learned about the appointment. A car was parked strategically next to the racketeer's borrowed vehicle. Inside that car, wired carefully through the frame and engine compartment, was a powerful explosive device. The bombers waited in their getaway car, watching for the perfect moment. The racketeer approached his vehicle and began entering. A button was pressed. The explosion was massive and instantaneous. The blast tore through both vehicles with such force that both cars were reduced to pieces of twisted metal and shattered glass. The racketeer was killed instantly. The man who had survived every previous attempt, who had built a reputation as impossible to kill, was dead. Smoke and flames consumed what remained of both vehicles. Witnesses observed the hitman fleeing in a blue car. One witness, a sketch artist, would draw an accurate portrait of a hitman that led to his arrest. The Irishman's reign of fearless defiance against the Cleveland Mafia had ended in the most violent way possible. The racketeer who had once seemed indestructible had been destroyed completely. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.